You're talking about Connie?
Right. So I was at the La Hacienda restaurant where she worked one day. My dad had been at some meeting, and I would often, when I was in New Mexico, having teleported there either with him or with some of the other children in the project or even by myself, I mean, I was going over to the teleport at Curtis Wright and just jumping through there, ultimately with the casualness with which somebody would get onto a public bus, you know, to go across town to go to school. So on this particular afternoon, I found myself at one of the restaurants in Old Town Albuquerque where Connie Chavez had not only been born and grew up, but where she lived her whole life there in Old Town Albuquerque. And my dad came back to the restaurant, and he was troubled about something he had been briefed on. And she found out what it was, and she didn't seem as concerned as my father was. And it may have just very well been my efforts within the disclosure movement to bring about public awareness that the U.S. government achieved quantum access based on time travel technology from around 1970. It may have been literally the moment when he discovered that I was the principal whistleblower on Project Pegasus, because he was disturbed by what he had found. And Connie said, just in passing, well, does he do this before or after he finds all that stuff up on Mars? And because she had revealed some of my future destiny to me in an uncontrolled way like that, my dad looked over and scowled at her as if to say, you're not supposed to talk about Andy's future in front of him. Because, you know, every time they shared future data with an individual like myself in Project Pegasus, there had been a decision to do so. They weren't just sharing information about people's lives willy-nilly. That data had entered intelligence reports that they were reading. And there had to be a command decision to release specific data to a specific person. As, for example, my father did in fall of '71 when he showed me my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, that clearly had been acquired from the future and taken back to the early '70s, so that was in his possession. It was literally in his briefcase from work. So my dad looked over at Connie and scowled at her because she was sort of letting the cat out of the bag, and you're not supposed to do that, because the danger of that is that the person might not implement their destiny as a result of having already learned about it. In fact, every time my dad shared some aspect of my destiny with me, he did it in a way where I talk about it being a double green light. He would sort of make it a positive thing. He would say, well, see, this is what we're telling you you're going to do, so be sure to do it. You know, sort of like that. They didn't want to dissuade anybody from avoiding their destiny as a result of learning some aspect or aspects of it before the fact. So that was another instance where Connie knew, you know, this longtime companion of my father's, one of his best friends in life, and this woman that he had known for 20 years at that point, or almost 20 years, was aware that part of my destiny involved the discovery of life on Mars, discovering life on Mars. So those were the data points in my childhood before adolescence. We then moved to California in 1972. I was in the 6th grade, and I had fairly normal experiences in junior high and high school. I was certainly not attached to Project Pegasus. I had a normal Southern California adolescence. And, you know, wrestling in school, playing saxophone in the school band, swimming in swimming pools, going to the beach. I had, you know, a very ordinary teenage years there in Chatsworth, California. I went off to UC San Diego for my freshman year in 1979-80, and then in the fall of 1980, I transferred to UCLA. Beginning in the summer of 1981, the U.S. government put a CIA officer in my life. Now, unless you've been subject to this, it's really hard to explain how this is done. Basically, you're given a mentor who has conversations with you and shares intelligence community tradecraft with you, and even specific information, but sometimes when you ask them questions, they don't answer. So this was like the cigarette-smoking man that they put in my life, who I knew really for the next 20 years until he had a stroke in the early 10s. His name was Courtney M. Hunt. He was one of the Orange County, California cousins of the Hunts of Texas, being the dynasty associated with Harold's and Lafayette Hunt and his sons Lamar and Nelson Bunker Hunt. Courtney Hunt was from that family. He was their California cousin. He looked sort of like Richard Helms, the former CIA director. He was a tall, sort of Scottish landed gentry kind of person, had kind of a bald head, kind of looked like Hunter Thompson or Arno de Borchgrave, kind of thinning hair. But he was a chain cigarette smoker, and he was career CIA. In fact, he had joined the CIA during the Korean War when he did jumps behind enemy lines via parachute. So he had seen some very serious experiences as a CIA agent. Courtney lived in Chatsworth and had semi-retired in his early 50s in the early 1980s, but he was still working for CIA. You never really leave the U.S. intelligence community. And he was placed in my life as sort of a mentor who was trying to recruit me for CIA as well. Now, I rebuffed that recruitment attempt just like I had rebuffed my father's attempt to have me apply and be admitted to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis when I was in high school. So this was the second attempt to get me back inside the military intelligence community, if you will. I had been in Pegasus as a kid. I had performed well as one of the children in the project. In fact, I had jumped through all the hoops and had been one of the children involved in jumping through the Stargate at the Cerrillos Cultural Center outside of Santa Fe to access the year 2045 and then bring back via teleportation to the radio antenna array, the microwave tower called Continental Divide in southwestern Colorado, near the Lobo Overlook site associated with the area north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado. I had gone to the future via the Stargate device at Cerrillos and come back via southwestern Colorado and provided the U.S. Defense Department summaries of future events, what I call in my book, the history of the future. What these were microfilm canisters with hundreds of feet of tape on which were digitized, so they couldn't be detected if these devices were lost. They were digitized summaries of intervening events between 1970 and 2045. Imagine microfilm, hundreds and hundreds of feet of microfilm of, issues of Time magazine. I don't think it was Time. I think they were actually, I had been told they were historical summaries of particular events and people, and photographs and technologies and so forth, and world events, and encyclopedic and biographical information about people that had been prepared in 2045 and were being sent back on a tactical basis to give the Defense Department information about the future to basically allow the U.S. government to engage in contingency planning for the most serious events. One of the things the U.S. government, more specifically the Central Intelligence Agency, was concerned about in the early 1970s was the prospect of a new ice age that would destabilize civilization. The concern about that and some of the data that we collected in Pegasus, by the time I was no longer attached to Pegasus in 1972, or by the end of 1972, was their concern that there would be a mass flooding event, either before or after a mass ice age type of cataclysm. So I clearly had been identified as a person of interest when I was on Pegasus, because my father ultimately became angry at me when he learned that I was destined to be the chief whistleblower about the quantum access capabilities that Project Pegasus achieved on behalf of the U.S. government. So there was a concern that they get me back within the realm of secret government operations. The first attempt was when I was about 15 or 16. My dad sat me down and said, "Let's talk about your application to Annapolis." And I said, "My what?" And that even got as far as a scheduled meeting with our congressman, who was Barry Goldwater Jr. Admission to the military academies in the United States require an interview by your congressman. And so I had an interview scheduled with Representative Barry Goldwater Jr. that I didn't go to. In fact, his secretary called me and chewed me out for